All set? Yeah, okay. I think this is good. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Melani Cammett. I'm the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and a faculty member in the government department. And I want to welcome all of you to the Manshel lecture entitled The Future of Climate Change, a Conversation with Gina McCarthy and Jim Stock. And this is really appropriate on the cusp of Earth Day, so I think it's a great conversation that we're having here today and one that we definitely need to keep having. Let me give you a little bit of background on the Manshel Lecture. The Warren and Anita Manshel Lecture in American Foreign Policy was established at the Center for International Affairs in 1993 by members of the Manshel family and by many of their friends. It stands as a memorial to the Manshels' longstanding commitment to public affairs and their desire to advance greater understanding of the international relations of the United States. We're really particularly honored to have members of the Manshel family here today, and so we very much appreciate David Manshel and his son, Alexander Manshel. Thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank the Office of Sustainability and the Weatherhead Research Cluster on Climate for helping to make this lecture possible. We're so fortunate today to have Gina McCarthy here with us. Gina was the first ever White House National Climate Advisor and is one of the nation's most respected voices on climate change, the environment, and public health. As head of the Climate Policy Office under President Biden, McCarthy's leadership led to the most aggressive action on climate in U.S. history, creating new jobs and unprecedented clean energy innovation and investments across the country. Her commitment to bold action across the Biden administration, supported by the climate and clean energy provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, restored U.S. climate leadership on a global scale and put a new U.S. national target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Throughout her years of public service in both Republican and Democratic administrations, McCarthy is credited for her common sense strategies and ability to work across the aisle with states, communities, business leaders, and the labor community to tackle our nation's toughest environmental challenges in ways that spur economic growth and improve public health for workers and families, and especially those living in environmental justice communities. Before joining the Biden administration, McCarthy was president and CEO of the National Resources Defense Council, which is one of the nation's largest and most influential environmental advocacy organizations. Prior to this, she was a professor of the practice of public health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where she served as the director of the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment. So she's definitely no stranger to Harvard. During this time, she engaged students and climate science thought leaders across the faculty, as well as corporate and nonprofit leaders across the world to coordinate strategies to turn climate and health science into actions that promote a healthier and just world. From 2013 to 2017, McCarthy was the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. McCarthy there focused on using science and input from broad external engagement to strengthen clean air standards, including establishing tighter standards on mercury pollution, a new EPA clean water rule to protect rivers and streams that provide safe drinking water for millions of Americans, and a whole variety of other initiatives that she undertook under her leadership there. Let me also turn to introducing our very own Jim Stock, who is going to be in conversation with Gina today. Jim Stock is the Harold Hitchings Burbank Professor of Political Economy here at Harvard in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He's also a member of the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research areas are empirical macroeconomics, monetary policy, econometric methods, and of course, energy and environmental policy. And he has substantial experience in the field of energy environmental policy and is a key figure in Harvard's climate and sustainability efforts. As Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, Jim leads the development of a coordinated university-wide strategy to address climate change, bringing greater focus, clarity, and visibility to Harvard's extraordinary breadth of work on climate and sustainability. He partners with faculty, researchers, students, and staff around the university, marshals and amplifies our efforts to bridge disciplines and tackle the cross-cutting challenges that climate change brings to the world. We're also particularly grateful that we've managed to rope him into our tiny little corner of Harvard involved in our cluster, our research cluster on climate change. So let me just briefly tell you about the format here this afternoon. Gina's going to come up and address you from the podium with some thoughts about the future of climate change, and then she's going to turn to a conversation with Jim. We'll then move to Q&A with the audience. So when it's time, I invite you to come up. We're going to have a mic, I believe, in the center here. So I'll invite you to come up to the microphone and pose your questions to Gina or Jim or both of them. Thank you so much for coming here today, and please help me to welcome Gina McCarthy.
Well, first of all, thank you, Melanie, and I really appreciate the fact that you read that entire bio. But I want to assure everybody that I'm really only 35 years old, so it's been a remarkable career. It's just tough to work in the White House. But Jim, thank you. Melanie, thanks really for inviting me to speak today. And Jim, thank you for all the work that you've been doing. That we have a secret, and that is that we worked together when Jim was in the White House. I think we effectively did what the White House always does. We drove each other crazy. But in the end, we came out in very good places with some difficult challenges that we were both struggling with. So it was really fun, and it's terrific to be back at Harvard. Just the energy in these buildings is enough to give everybody hope that there's an opportunity for the future, and Harvard never fails to deliver those young, bright minds that actually can make things happen. So I'm excited to be here. And let me begin just by assuring you of something that everybody asks me at the end of my speech, so I'll hit this issue at the beginning. You know, all of the work that I'm going to be talking about, all of the work that we got done in the first couple of years of the Biden administration, the executive actions, the investments in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and all those, they're on very solid ground in both blue and red states. So I just want to put that out right now before you ask me later, and we can talk about it later, but it is remarkable the changes that we're seeing on the ground, both in terms of people's hopefulness for the future, the investments, the changes that are happening in communities and that we anticipate to happen. And I would argue that the clean energy transition is soon going to be on steroids. Now, that mostly means that all of our roads and things are going to be dug up, so you're going to have to be patient about never being able to get anywhere. Buildings are going to be built. Good things are going to happen. So be patient. It's exciting. You know, this is a time for us, I think, to be confident that the United States is where it should have been a long time ago, but we are where we have to be right now. And I am so excited about the progress that's made and the opportunities that we have moving forward. And as Melanie made clear, and many of you know, I've been in government for decades and decades and decades. In fact, I've worked for 6 governors, 5 of whom were Republicans. I wrote Governor Romney's climate plan when he was governor in Massachusetts way back when. And I was instrumental in getting the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative implemented when I worked for Governor Rell in Connecticut. Both Republicans. Really good stuff happened. And I have also worked for 2 presidents, and guess what? Neither of them were Republican. but they've both remained incredibly vocal and visible and strong in their commitment to address climate change. And so I'm really proud of that work. I'm proud of the work that we got Republicans and Democrats together. Yes, it may be New England, but I don't care. They were red, they were blue, we can be purple together. That's the way it works. In fact, I joined President Biden's team as the country's first national climate advisor because of the commitment of President Biden. You know, and because of one really interesting thing, and it is that he knew something about climate change that we don't talk about, and in fact, I never fully appreciated. He knew and spoke about, even during the campaign, that climate change was not going to drag down his administration, nor was it going to delay his efforts to restart the post-COVID economic recovery. In fact, he argued just the opposite. He knew that climate change could be the driver of our country's recovery. That's how he viewed it. For once, us climate advocates weren't hiding in the closet, waiting to sneak out. We came there front and center because this president sort of understood that if we just break out of that mold, that climate is a disaster, and look at it as the biggest opportunity of our life right now, that we could grab it and make change happen. Now, I'm not saying that we should stop reminding people that climate change is the biggest existential challenge of our time. It is, and we should keep reminding them of that. And I've been very focused, as many of you know, on talking about the health benefits that come with clean energy so that people can get excited about the changes that we really need and make the benefits and what benefits those actions really bring to them. But climate action is really more than that, and President Biden got it. Climate action is about building the economy of the future, a future where fossil fuels no longer have to cower in the face of fossil fuels. Instead, they win the battle for the hearts and minds and pocketbooks of the American public. That's what we can do with climate action today. And it's a future that will push all of those skeptics aside and put the U.S. in a leadership position on climate change. So after 20 years of local and state efforts that I have participated in to try new ideas, new policies, think about strategies, Joe Biden knew that the solutions that we needed to make progress on climate fast were already there for us to grab. Finally, so he made climate change one of his strongest and most compelling commitments. And he was simply fearless in making his position clear and driving that change at every opportunity that he had available. And while some question, as they always do, why the administration should focus on climate change, given the huge challenges facing our nation back when President Biden came into office, and it's understandable. But it's true that people were really struggling under the weight of their pandemic. We knew that. They were struggling from the isolation and from the uncertainty. But the president also knew that if you want to shift that around, you have to get on a path of hope and certainty. That's what you need to do. And it's a future that he was thinking about that would grow jobs for millions of people who had already lost theirs and needed an opportunity once again. To give families a break so they could save money in their energy bills and at the pump, and make sure that communities who have been sidelined for far too long would get their fair share of investments. These were the pillars that President Biden put before us that we had to deliver in terms of a strategy to make this change happen. So he was determined to invest in innovation again, to jumpstart domestic manufacturing, to rebuild those communities that were left behind, not just for climate, but to get our country moving forward again in ways that could lift people out of poverty and once again begin to expand our middle class. Now, I know that sounds like big deal stuff. It is. But he knew that climate could help drive that agenda forward if we were focused and careful about what we asked for and what we invested in. You know, it was the job of my little climate office to find ways to do this. How great a job description that must have been. But that's why I went back to DC. I didn't go back there because the pay was great. In fact, NRDC had great pay. And I took an 80% pay cut in order to work at the White House. But it was a gift for me that I just couldn't say no to, because I knew that it would provide an opportunity for us to actually elevate this issue in a way that would immediately get our country excited again, especially the young people that have been fighting so hard to try to find a path forward to a future that they could find themselves in, a future that their families would be growing in. That's what we wanted to do. And under Biden's leadership and with the support of his cabinet, which was frankly amazing, so we can chit-chat about them, and I'll give you all kinds of secrets, in the White House, we worked to open up these economic opportunities through clean energy investments, both public and private. We knew they could deliver. And with leadership at the federal level, we began to unlock resources that our country really needed to deploy at scale, not just to deploy, to move products and technologies into the market today that were available to us and would allow us to outcompete when it comes to fossil fuels. We started the ball rolling. If maybe you remember it, maybe you don't watch TV, that's okay too. But we started the ball rolling with this big event on the White House lawn about electric vehicles. Now, you may think that's a weird place to start, but guess what? It was an agreement we reached with the United Auto Workers before we approached the companies themselves. Because the United Auto Workers agreed that if they wanted a future, they had to build the technology of the future today. That while there may be fewer people in every plant, because they're not as complicated to build, that it would advance investments across the world that would come to the United States, and on the whole, they would hugely benefit with new job openings. And we convinced them to play. And then we convinced GM, and we convinced Ford, then we convinced Chrysler, and we went down and down and down and down and down, Stellantis. All those companies began to join in, so that when we had the White House event, every major car company was supportive of moving on electric vehicles at a pace that they had never thought to commit before. So in the end, it stresses me to say that James Carville might be right. Climate change is about the economy, stupid. Winning the future is about recognizing how you take the problems of the past and you turn the opportunities of today to actually build the path that we can move forward together. So we stepped it up. You know, we started rallying the whole of government after the EV event. We opened up opportunities for carbon reduction in every single sector. We energized a coalition of young people, the labor community, the health advocates, young people, environmental justice leaders, innovators, business leaders. We were bringing everybody together in a room to talk about what could be done and how we get it done. And we implemented and designed policies and investment strategies that could take a bite out of climate change while providing fundamental benefits to families and communities. That's the secret sauce. That is how you make change happen. And to meet these goals, we had to work hard in every key sector of the economy. That's what produced the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Because the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was usually important to go first because it impacts investments in every single community that are fundamental infrastructure that will make communities' lives better and also build the kind of infrastructure we need for clean energy moving forward. And we move forward with the Inflation Reduction Act because the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was great, but it wasn't going to be enough. It didn't accelerate in a way that we needed it. And we needed to accelerate the momentum throughout our manufacturing sector, throughout the products that we would produce, to talk about how we would jumpstart our economy and drive groundbreaking reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And collectively, the actions in these laws, in addition to the CHIPS and Science Act, gave the biggest boost that any country had ever given or thought about that would move us forward on climate change. And so I'm really proud of the work that got done. You know, we have a bipartisan infrastructure law that's $1.2 trillion. We have the Inflation Reduction Act that's $370 billion for climate. We have the CHIPS and Science Act that's $50+ billion. We are talking not about chump change here, folks. We're talking about the kind of change that changes everything. And frankly, that's exactly where we needed to be. And that is what is going to actually drive us towards a cleaner and healthier future for American workers and for their families. So I won't continue to go on. We can ask questions about this. But I will tell you that the momentum continues in the White House. I think we've all learned a lesson. There are wonderful ways in which we can set bold goals, and ways in which we can drive innovation to move those goals forward and to meet them. We set up very difficult targets, and each and every time we met those targets because we didn't sit alone. We realized that in order to get this done, it wasn't just about what the government wanted or the government wanted to do. It was getting people to understand that an economy needs to grow and needs to grow now. And there were businesses all across the United States that saw this as their best opportunity for not just public but private sector investment. We are talking right now of exceeding $600 billion in investments. And we have now an EPA that is underpinning all of this change with regulatory regulations like the most recent proposed one that is going to get us to half of our cars being sold in the United States by 2030 to be electric vehicles. This is how change happens. It's exciting, it can be frustrating, but honestly, there's just nothing like it. So I'm sorry, NRDC, I'm glad I left. Please hire me again for as much money. No, I'm only kidding. So it's great to be here, and we'll chat, and thank you for all of your patience and listening. But honestly, it is a moment of hope and certainty, but it still requires that we fight like hell every single day to say this is good, but what's next? This is good, but we need to do more. This is good, but our future is still at stake. And we have to work every single day to take our learning here and work with countries all across the world so that everybody can feel that there is an opportunity for them. And frankly, even if Congress can't come up with money to pay for loss and damages in other countries, which they should do, we will find a way to drive private investment so that we don't lose precious years across our world in fighting or feuding. We must stand together because, after all, climate change is a global problem. Thank you very much. Anita? Jim's not allowed to ask me hard questions, or I'll start telling stories about him in the White House.
I actually think I will. I'll get to the hard questions later. But Gina, that was fantastic. That's just terrific. I mean, I have to say, I'm so jealous of my colleagues and friends who are down there, and so jealous of you. You arrived. Biden was elected at this golden moment where. Unfortunately, many of the challenges, many of the actual problems of physical climate change are upon us, and we're seeing that. You didn't mention that, but that actually permeates much of the discussion that led into the public support for making these actions. And then at the same time, we just had this unbelievably fortuitous coincidence that wind and solar prices and battery prices were deeply declining, and it was actually, one could actually see making this transition in a way that benefited workers and benefited jobs and benefited the economy.
It wasn't happenstance though, Jim.
No.
I mean, there was a lot of work that went into those technologies and those opportunities to make sure that they could compete. And that was what opened up. I mean, I worked in the state level for so long, and I cannot tell you the number of years that we spent trying to figure out how to build that platform of new technologies and invest. And it took a long time, but you know, the interesting thing about change, and it just could be in my crazy little optimistic head, but when change starts, it tends to pick up on its own momentum. It's like people. When you see everybody running to something, you're like, oh, what is that? I want one of those. That's what's going to happen here. We won't need this level of continued investment in order for the private sector to step it up.
Right. So that's very true. I think it is the case that there was persistent policy support and public support in certain states and in parts of the in some federal government entities for wind and solar and batteries when they simply weren't cheap. I think if you remember 10 years ago, you know, there was a lot of excitement about small modular reactors and, you know, other things like that. Wind and solar really did work, and that, you know, so
There still is a lot of discussion about small.
There still is a lot of discussion of small.
Generally, it's a school down the street, not right here.
Let me ask you one question. I've always wondered what it must have been like. So the history of the legislation. So it started out with the formulation, first of all, of the Green New Deal, but then formulation into actual legislation in Build Back Better. That had a long and anguished history. There were some really dark moments. Things kept getting peeled away. There must have been was there ever a moment in which you just said, well, we've got to really turn to a plan B here because we're not going to get any legislation through? I mean, certainly from the outside, as of like, you know, June of whatever, 2022, it just looked like the IRA. I mean, there's no IRA in sight. BBB was gone.
Oh, ye of little faith. No, Jim, you're right. There were ups and downs in the discussion, as you can imagine, because, you know, it wasn't just that there are people who were against it, but they kept changing their mind about what they liked and didn't like.
Exactly.
And that was the most frustrating part, because you can make adjustments and things. It wasn't an all or nothing deal, you know, but there were certain things in it that if we didn't get, we wouldn't be able to accelerate. You know, it just wasn't fundamentally going to have the drive that we all thought that we needed. So, but, you know, there's a couple of things that I'm not sure people appreciate as much as they should, is that you know, Biden is, should I call him Biden? I probably shouldn't, huh? President Biden. I don't call him Biden to his face. I don't call him Joe either. Maybe I should just call him Joe, and then you'll think we're really tight. The president, he knows how to be in Congress, and he knows how to manage Congress. You know, he's been there so long, and his relationships are so long, and he was a very patient person. He refused to react to those ins and out issues. He hung tough, and we had, I would say, 9,000 different alternative plans that we were, towards the end, getting very anxious to do something, only because anxiety just breeds anxiety. But and we'd made changes. We did, and they turned out to be even better in a couple of cases than the originals in terms of the amount of reductions you could get. So we just had to be patient. And he had a great team working on this in the White House, but we're talking about, you know, the White House is a busy place, as you know, Jim. It just never stops. So it's every weekday and it's every weekend.
Yeah.
And those, you know, it's adjustments here, thinks about that. Why do they want that? What are they trying to do? So it's a pain in the neck. But we got it.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly impressive, and it obviously is the case that you really pulled through. I mean, I just want to just digress for one moment. One thing that you mentioned in your talk is that you started out. You gave the story of starting out by pulling in the auto companies. I really want to make sure the audience doesn't miss the importance of that.
Yeah.
It's one thing to codify all of that in legislation, such as the EV credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, but you have to build all of the groundwork and you have to build the support for that.
Yeah.
And the industry was coming from a point at the end of the Trump administration where there was actually internal divisions within the industry about even things like supporting this California waiver. Then there was lawsuits, the industry had a schism, and you had to heal that and deal with that first before you could generate the political support. So I don't think that's really a question as much as making sure people really understand how much a lot of this stuff that looks from the outside is just like one more tedious event at the White House was incredibly important.
It was incredibly difficult to make that happen. You know, but I had a great team. I mean, Ali Zaidi is now the White House National Climate Advisor for the president, and he's just brilliant. I mean, most of us had history in Washington, so you kind of knew a lot of the players out there, but you couldn't assume anything. You know that. And it's again, it was continued coalition building. We were really worried about the unions.
Yeah.
We knew what their dilemma was, that they were worried that with the shift to EVs, there were just fewer jobs. And we kept telling them, no, you're losing whole manufacturing right now. We need more manufacturing, and then we can get the same amount of jobs. It's just different. And we had to, really work hard to show the numbers for that. But GM stepped out very quickly on this, and then Ford did the F-150, and then, the president went and drove it around like a maniac with the Secret Service chasing after him. And everybody, I think, then got a sense that these vehicles are something different. Yeah. People started to really pay attention, and it took off from there. But every sector we did had to have that kind of watch. We had to watch it every day, communication with all of them. We brought all of the companies to the White House on numerous occasions. The president was always gracious with his time to sit down and talk to people. We had every solar manufacturer there. We had the wind manufacturers. We had, you name it, in every sector. We had people in the White House listening, gauging how far we could go, what the sticking points were, how we get around those, and it was for me it was very eye-opening, and honestly part of it was that they had been stuck for a while.
Yeah.
The companies were not succeeding under the prior administration because they didn't want to invest in this stuff. So it gave us an opening, but we didn't want to make the run so fast that we left them behind. That was the key.
Yeah, from a lot of the companies' perspectives, it was a tough place because they could see the world market changing, and they could see the technology changing, and they could see the future. And it was clear GM, you mentioned, was first out of the gate there from the majors. Yep. And they could see that changing, but it was difficult under the previous administration to actually make those steps and have the certainty that's needed to really make those
Offshore
decisions.
wind was very challenging too.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And they still have some big challenges, but they don't seem dissuaded by them, but they're challenging.
So let me switch gears just a little bit. Probably a bad analogy since EVs don't have gears, but let me switch gears just a little bit here and talk. You spent many years of your life in a regulatory capacity, and of course you were head of the EPA back in the Obama administration. EPA just came out with a very major regulation last week on tailpipe emissions. So a little bit of background, everybody's probably familiar with these fuel economy regulations that we have in the United States. There's a new round of those justified under the Clean Air Act, but a new round of those that is very ambitious and takes into account the fact that we are going to be having under the IRA and under technology changes a high rate of EV adoption. And the EPA just came out with a proposed rule that sets very ambitious standards. Even if you're an EV optimist, as I am, they're very ambitious standards.
Yeah, they are.
67% EV adoption.
How dare they?
By 2032. So that raises a couple of questions. And so and I'm going to just focus on those regulations. And so I'm going to raise two questions. Then you can. One question is, I'm sorry if we're doing weeds, but I have to do a little bit of weeds.
This is what he did in the White House.
One question is, the Supreme Court has embraced this new doctrine called the major questions doctrine. When that was applied to a previous regulation, one stemming out of what we worked on, to the power sector, they said that the regulation was too ambitious because it would drive down coal, and driving coal out of the economy was too big a thing. Congress didn't speak to it. It's a major question. It's not in the legislation. We as the Supreme Court have the ability to say, no, you don't cover it. I don't see how driving internal combustion engines out of the economy is any different than driving coal out of the economy. So doesn't this rule really ask for it to be a major questions issue? The second question is, that aside, isn't this just asking for introducing political strife in the context of what's going to be happening, I think anyway, because of the economics? And we're already seeing political pushback. How can you dare take away my internal combustion engine from certain elements? And I know you're all about engagement and community and trying to bridge those divides. So that this rule raised these two important questions, to me at least.
Well, let me sort of sandwich it between other important questions. Is what do you do when transportation is the biggest source of carbon emissions in the United States? What do you do if you do your cost-benefit analysis on the automobile sector, which is what you do, and you find out that more people than ever will have cleaner air than they've ever had before? And more people than ever will have more cost-effective vehicles than ever, and it'll be cheaper to drive. It'll reduce the amount of fossil fuels that you need to utilize. And so you know yourself, there's a lot that goes into this. I actually don't see that EPA's analysis under this particular action is all that similar to what was happening with the utility world that the Supreme Court spoke to in the major questions issue. But I mean, if we sort of make our decisions based on this Supreme Court, we would do absolutely nothing, because it's the only thing that this Supreme Court will allow us to do. So we'll have to see what happens when it gets there. But I think that is the signal that the car industry is giving to us, is that this is the future. We have, $500,000 that's going to building EV charging stations all across the United States. Beyond that, the interesting thing about this that gave me a lot of hope was that when you do when you develop the system, you give the money to the states, and the states have these built with the IBEW and others providing support. And everybody was worried, because part of the process is to make sure that the states have a good plan before they get their money. So the Department of Transportation put out a call to every state and said, submit your plans by a given date. And when I was in the White House, everybody was going like, we should bet on how many actually do that. Because you just don't think some of these governors would be bothered. You know, so everybody's saying, well, you know, there's 12 that we know would, and those are the goody-goody states like Massachusetts, you know, New York, California, those guys. And then there's maybe 20, but it came back, and every single state had submitted a plan that checked every single complicated box on the guidance document for it. And so it just told me that, you know, they may fight, and you're right, you may have a Supreme Court that doesn't like it, but we are talking about real money to real people. And even governors who would rather not talk about electric vehicles will take that money and they will build those stations because they will not be the state that everybody has to drive around, right? It's not good for business. And so, I think the less we make of the drama around this and just let life take its merry way, I think we'll be okay. Now, what, you know, but you know the Supreme Court, maybe they'll be on some expensive travel at the time that this comes up, and sorry, I couldn't help myself. But you gave me a second. What was the second question?
Well, the second one.
I forget.
So just for clarification, what you were referring to was the $5 billion state grant program and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and then the states had to actually submit a plan so that you could, the feds could give them the money for these. These are all level 3 on the sort of high freeway style charging stations. And that was actually, I have to say, an extremely well-written set of guidelines that the Department of Transportation provided too. I mean, that was you can see why the states were able to be responsive because the feds were asking very clear requests.
They were, that took an awful long time to do.
Yes, I can imagine so.
Many meetings with very boring people saying very boring things.
Which were actually probably all important.
Hugely.
The other part of this was thinking about you know much of what you talked about, and I've heard you've written about this too, and a ongoing theme of even when you were here at Harvard is how the energy transition should be something that benefits everybody economically, so that everybody's able to embrace it, and that's a very sort of inclusive approach, whether you're Republican or Democrat. We should all see this as in our interest, and I'm worried that about the political interpretation of this EPA regulation, and we're already seeing pushback and Twitter excitement about, well, you're going to take away my internal combustion engine vehicle, and I don't want to buy EVs, but you're going to force me to, and that's sort of a dividing message, and so that's another concern about this rule.
Well, I think people will, Jim, that people will have choices, and it's a proposed rule, so you expect that kind of give and take that comes in. But the way these rules work, and Jim, you know this well, is that, they have to look at the technology that's possible. They have to evaluate it from a cost perspective. They have to evaluate it in terms of the benefits it provides. And in the end, it may not be as aggressive. I have no idea. It all depends on the comments that come in. But the last thing you want to do is underestimate at the beginning. You don't want to go weak and then go strong. You usually put your best foot forward. You ask zillions of questions in this thing about whether or not these estimates seem reasonable. But, I don't know a whole lot of people that have driven an electric car that didn't want one. And the Ford F-150, that is an EV, has been sold out every single time they do more. It's just amazing. And part of the joy of that particular vehicle is that, you can use them to actually supply electricity to your house when you don't have electricity. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so there's all kinds of ways in which I think the technologies of the future and the ones that are available to us now will get over this drama about the shift and be more about what else can they do.
Yeah, no, I totally,
Yeah.
totally agree on sort of the cost projections and the sort of the fun of driving EVs. It's quite an experience for those who haven't done it.
And I'm quite sure that the lawsuits would go in the other direction if the agency didn't follow the rules where it led. So there's lawsuits always for everything, so
Yeah.
we'll see where it goes.
So one thing to shift on here, one thing to shift on when I was in the White House, and something I worked on, and something that's been an ongoing matter of interest in the environmental community, is thinking about is trying to wrap one's head around the fact that the federal government actually is sort of trying to do two things at once that seem sort of intellectually at least challenging. And one of them is taking all of these aggressive steps that the Biden administration has on supporting the manufacturing facilities for batteries, on reducing the number, on increasing the amount of adoption of EVs, on making EVs cheaper, on supporting the transformation of the power sector, doing all of those things that has been hard work. And at the same time, we're producing a substantial amount of our oil and gas and coal on federal lands. So we're the landlord that is selling leases and encouraging production, and we're, on the other hand, sort of the entity that's saying, well, but we probably shouldn't use it. So there's sort of an intellectual tension there. And early in the Biden administration, in a first-week executive order, there was some very aggressive language about taking a close look at the federal fossil fuel leasing program, changing the leasing structure to incorporate the cost of the damages caused by the emissions from the fuel or the oil and so forth that's produced on federal lands. That essentially just disappeared. So there's, I would say, approximately a 180 on that. And so it's moved from having a moratorium on oil and gas, which was then lifted, to having the largest lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico, moved from having an ambitious increase in the royalties to accepting a very small increase in the royalties to 16.67% in the Inflation Reduction Act, moving to permit Willow, moving the ConocoPhillips project in Alaska, moving to encourage Saudi Arabia or get annoyed when Saudi Arabia says we're going to cut production. What's going on?
I was waiting for the question. Lots. Look, there's two things that, well, there's a number of things that underpin all that, Jim, and I think you know them well. First of all, the administration made many decisions to try to limit additional drilling on federal lands. We lost every single time. There's a reason for that. The law requires it. The same with Gulf of Mexico. The law requires that it be done. Now, it takes 10 years before you're going to see anything happen. And so there's plenty of time for people to start rethinking these things. But we're dealing with laws that are 100 years old. They're irrelevant to today. But the courts that you get sent to because of where the drilling occurs are not courts that are going to be friendly to any change in the status quo. And we could keep, that was part of a lot of the discussion. You're absolutely right. There was discussion about what to do with federal lands in the Gulf and all kinds of things. But there's a reality here that we cannot change the law unless Congress changes it. Otherwise, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot and spending a huge amount of time and anxiety on that. Now, Willow's different. I mean, that's a decision that got made. It was minimalized, but it was still done. But it's not different in the sense that it would have been legally challenged. And there's good reason to think that the law was not on the administration's side to say no to that. There's good reason to believe that. So it's challenging. And then you have a war in Ukraine. And of course, you're going to do everything you can to try to support that war And so there was ramping up on the LNG terminals to get more LNG exported. We did not expand our capacity, but we utilized it. So, I mean, these things are fluctuations. But one of the things it led to, Jim, all those early on sort of losses, loss after loss in the courts, and frankly, we did very little oil and gas drilling compared to the Obama administration, but I still love President Obama. The thing that we realized was that really the best bet is to shift demand, is to focus on that side of the equation. And so this whole thing is being done with an eye towards if our clean energy strategy can compete effectively against fossil fuels, that's where the soft underbelly of that industry has to lie. Because right now, it's not in getting Congress to change those old laws, and it's certainly not going to the courts expecting that they're going to make other decisions than they've been making for the past 100 years.
Yeah, and I think it is also really driven home not just the political sensitivity, but also the importance to consumers and businesses of energy price stability and energy security type issues in a way that perhaps we weren't all aware of, hadn't fully remembered prior to the war in Ukraine. And that's an additional, not so much constraint, but just a political reality that one needs to
and all the countries are struggling with this right now.
Of course. Of course.
It's really, it's just going to be difficult. You have to have energy. Yeah. And you have to deal with the need for fossil fuels. You can't deny it.
Yep. At the same time as making the transition aggressively, you still need to ensure price stability and security and reliability.
Yep.
So, so let me ask just one other question, because I bet we have a lot of interest in questions from the floor. So I have other things I could ask. But, in my day job, I'm Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, and so one way to frame this is, we've made a lot of progress. We have made a lot of progress over the last few years. Public recognition has really shifted, but at the same time, we are not on the track that we need to be on in terms of reducing emissions. As you said in your talk, we need to be asking ourselves, what can we do next? And we need to be doing that. And I think Harvard and many other universities are asking themselves, what can we do next and what should we be doing as a university? So major universities like ours have unique responsibilities and unique potential to make progress on these issues. So I guess I would ask you what I should be doing in my day job.
Oh my God.
What should Harvard, how can Harvard contribute?
Well, I guess what we did, it may be something to consider. I have this contamination. I don't know what the issue is. I have a cough and it just won't go away. Someday maybe I'll figure out how to get rid of it. It's grandchildren. If you have grandchildren, they're little petri dishes. So they walk over and give you a hug and you realize that they just wiped their nose on your shoulder and you wonder why you have a cough the following day. That's it. I have 3 young grandchildren that live in Dedham, which is right near where I live in Jamaica Plain, and they're 3 and 2 and 1. They're a hoot, but they're petri dish hoots.
I think you're avoiding the question here.
No, I'm not. I am a big believer in divestment, pure and simple. I would not spend students' money that they give to the university on things that the students think is a bad investment. So I would think about that. I would think about procurement. What are you buying and how are you buying it? I would think about energy efficiency in the buildings. I would think about, are there opportunities for solar that can be developed? Sort of the routine things you think about when you run a city, because this is a big place. But I think it's going to take a dedication and a tracking that's very serious. And it's hard, Jim.
I don't know what a vice provost does, but that doesn't sound exciting to me right now. Lots of fighting, I think.
Well,
Go for it!
Probably doesn't pay as much as NRDC.
What are you going to do for Earth Day?
I think we have a whole bunch of different activities planned, a lot of student activities. So
Good.
let's have questions, please. Yeah, and use the mic so that we can all can hear.
Gina, my name is Charles. I'm a senior at the college. I've been to a lot of cool events at Harvard, but this is by far the most cool speaker that I think we've had.
Oh, thanks. That's really nice.
So
It's because I tell the truth, isn't it? That's just ridiculous.
as part of it. So I have two questions.
Yeah,
One is around environmental justice domestically. The other is more internationally.
yeah.
Domestically, we're going to be building a lot of stuff for the Inflation Reduction Act. And I was at the FERC Environmental Justice Roundtable, and a lot of the frontline communities voiced that there's this big push to speed up the permitting and approval process, but there isn't a simultaneous effort to invest in real stakeholder engagement with these communities. So how do you think about embedding environmental justice in the building of all the clean energy projects that we're talking about? And the second, on a more international level, is given how hard it is to convince a significant chunk of this country that domestic climate investment is in their self-interest, specifically Republicans, but others as well, how do we convince them that foreign climate investment, which is really the next big push, is going to be something that's good for them as well? Thank you.
Okay. Let me go for the first. I think one of the most important things that were built into the Inflation Reduction Act was the set aside for environmental justice communities. 40% is a lot. It's $60 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's another $60 billion that's targeted for investment in environmental justice communities in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I think that the switch that needs to be made is that the thing that I'm not hearing, and I'm with you on the engagement. I am totally with you on that the community needs to be engaged when anything is proposed. That's the only way you're going to speed up permitting, if there's a legitimate dialogue and input. So there's a lot of investment now being made by NGOs to actually build the capacity, help the capacity of these communities to be able to engage effectively. So, but the thing that I'm not hearing, that I really would love to hear, and maybe I'm naive thinking it can be done, but what I was hoping would happen was that environmental justice communities wouldn't just be ready for the engagement, but they'd be putting their hand up, saying, in my community, this is the money I want to get for what I want. The only way this is going to work is if those communities sit down and talk among themselves about where they need improvements in their community and demand the investment there. That really helps on the permitting side. And I'm just not hearing that yet. Because I do think, instead of waiting to see what someone wants to throw at you, stand up and say, this is what I need. That's exactly the same discussion that's now happening in the international level. Is that this isn't about another friggin' solar panel in an African country that has no water or wastewater facility. That drives me nuts. This is not how you build things. It's about a really concerted effort to have, and this is happening across Africa, countries are beginning to establish their own net zero plans. If environmental justice communities did the same thing, then I think they should get twice as much money as that. Because now you say, I'm open for business. I don't want any more dirty buses. I need to have a rail that takes me to work every day within 20 minutes. That's what I'd love to see. And I haven't heard that corner being turned. And until we do that, it's going to be a struggle. But the time it takes to do permitting and analysis around these projects is going to stifle our ability to accelerate if we don't figure out how to engage environmental justice communities in ways that allow them to be confident that the investment they're going to make is benefiting them directly. That's the only way it's going to happen.
How does that happen? Are there like leading test cases, do pilots, you engage in certain examples, going back?
I don't have any. I'm not seeing that be the question. I think it's just a matter of working a different set of muscles. They've never been given the opportunity to design and redesign their own communities, right? Many have not.
Yeah, of course.
And so that's, I think that I'm hoping, after yapping at people for a while, that people are going to start funding those types of initiatives, because that's the only way it's going to work. And the question of investment, international investment, I think everybody knows at the last COP there was a commitment to loss and damages, and which is great. It requires that the U.S. spend, I don't know, something like, I forget how many billion, but a lot. I wonder why, right? We're the biggest emitter, so that makes sense. But the Congress won't give those resources. So the tricky part that we're trying to figure out is how to get private investment to really step up in the interim, which I think it's there, but there's a lot of argument and distrust over carbon markets as the strategy to get that done. And understandably, but I think we have to break through it. We have to have those investments go. It's embarrassing to have the United States do a plan like we did and be able to stand up and say, look how good we are, and we can't do anything to get money to the international community. That's nauseating, frankly. And so that has to change. Does that answer your questions? Okay.
Hi, Gina. Francesca Dominici, Professor of Biostatistics and Co-Director of Data Science Initiative at Harvard. So thank you and welcome back. So I have a question, and this is a really unique opportunity to ask a question to you because you spend time at the School of Public Health, with us, with our students, and then you also bring a lot of the experience in the government. And so, as you are talking about this transformational change in the climate, I've been thinking a lot, and a lot of my colleagues, is what is the role of the science and the intersection of climate and health? And so basically what I'm asking is, how this sausage, are made, right? Yep. Should we continue to make the same sausage? Should we change the way that we're looking at this question? And so when we are, most of us are trying to understand the health impact of this climate change related event, the climate, the health impact of this energy transition. Are these the right questions to ask? Or should we just do our research with different lens?
Or should you do what?
Should we do our research with different lens and ask different questions? And I know this is a hard question for you to
It is a hard question because, as an ex-EPA administrator, I know the only way we get anything done is to do that analysis. It's the only thing that mattered. And I think it matters a lot to people. So I don't see that changing a lot. Tell that to Jim. Jim. It matters a lot, in my opinion. Now, it's not the only thing that matters, that having that basic understanding. Cost, for sure, matters in doing the appropriate analysis under that. But honestly, the only reason why you take some of the actions you take under climate is because of the health implications it has on people. And I think I don't think people have any still, no matter how much research has been done, I don't think there's any concept of how many lives are lost because of pollution that's mostly from fossil fuels and others, and other chemicals that are out there. I'm doing a few things in my real life now. I'm actually working with some private investment companies to try to get money to the Global South and figure out the roadblocks that are there. But I'm also working with Bloomberg Philanthropies in their team because they're looking at, you know, how do we finally close all of the coal facilities out there, utilities, and how do we make that transition, especially in the rural communities, and also the petrochemical industry. The petrochemical industry has been a thorn in my side for a very, very long time, and that thorn is just getting bigger and bigger. It is dangerous what's happening. And so I think in my view, what you do is timeless. And you need to keep doing it. Sorry. You can be in a beauty pageant some other time or something, I don't know yet.
Please.
My name is Werner. First, I would like to thank you very, very much for your inspiring speech. As a former environmental minister in Germany, I appreciate very much the Inflation Reduction Act because it boosts the transformation in the US towards a climate neutral future. But on the other hand, it causes a lot of discussions, especially in Europe. Therefore, my first question is, are there any amendments to be expected regarding the cooperation between the US and Germany and the other European countries? And the second question, I would like to focus a little bit on what you already mentioned, the war Russia's against Ukraine on geostrategic, geopolitical, geoeconomic affairs. In a time where we need, let me say, joint action in order to fight against climate warming, we see on the political field that the autocratic governments in Russia, in China, they cause a lot of new policies against, let me say, the Western world, democracies on the other side. And therefore, my question is, what would you recommend as a strategy from the White House perspective to handle climate protection in a global context in a time of rising conflicts in the political areas?
That's not my job. I'm really sorry. You know, first let me explain what the first part of your question, your first question, I guess, was, because not everybody would recognize it, is that the EU has been critical of the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, because it is, they find it to be protectionist. And so we can talk that through, but and there is definitely an effort, and it's one that we built into this, is to get our manufacturing moving again. If you look at, I was just looking at a map of where the investments are going from the Inflation Reduction Act, and they're going mostly in red states in very large amounts, because those are the states that lost their manufacturing jobs. And that's where the investments are going in the private sector to rebuild. And we did that purposefully, because we've seeded production of very vital, you know, technology and products elsewhere. And you cannot continue to do that and continue to be, I think, the leader that the United States wants. Now, having said that, the Inflation Reduction Act is long, it has lots of provisions. There is only one provision that requires domestic content, one, and it's electric vehicles. The rest are gimmies. If you have domestic content, you'll get more of a tax break. Well, what the hell's wrong with that? So I think people are a little bit overreactive about this, but also I do know that the president has already made concessions and in his good discussions with the EU, with Japan and others, to try to make sure that even the EV section still does not do damage to the relationship that we have with car makers in other countries, and is actually beginning to find ways to advance manufacturing of these vehicles in the US, but in a way that's going to benefit those individual countries. So we'll find a way around it and through it when it's necessary, but I also think it may be a bit over-traumatized about its full extent. It's mostly the EVs. Oh, what was the second? Oh, your geopolitical one, geez, we can dwell on that later. I don't have, you know, there are so many large issues right now on the global side. They are a constant source of anxiety, I think, for many of us. And I know that one of the things that's very concerning is the relationship between the US and China. That is a considerable pressure point right now. I get it, I understand it. I can't tell you that I have a resolution for it, but I know that folks are thinking about it. You know, during the Obama administration, we did a lot of work with China, but it's a vastly different Chinese government right now than what we worked with. And so I don't, you know, thankfully that's not my job. But you have to recognize it when you're doing international work, because it's becoming a new, I'll be their friend, and all of, you know, and I won't be that friend for many countries. They're making, choosing sides. And one of the very smart things that China has been doing, not just with its Belt and Road Initiative, but all of the big investments and now the debt in these countries is all China. The debt is enormous, but the investments have been enormous. And so it's not clear how any of these things are going to be resolved anytime soon. Okay, we need to have not a depressing question.
Yeah. Please, yeah.
Hi, Gina. Hi, Jim. My name is Sarah. Gina, I actually worked with you at the EPA a long time ago. It's probably way too long ago for you to remember.
Did you sign that baseball that I have in my house?
No, I did not. I didn't get the chance to do that.
Oh, man, I thought you were that. It must have been another year. They were much spunkier, apparently.
It was an internship.
What did you do?
So I was in the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations with Conna Johnston.
Yeah, excellent.
So I was actually there for an internship, and now I'm in the clean energy space in the private sector.
Great.
So kind of took a little pivot there, but still related.
No, that's good.
Yeah. So my question was actually in regards to the IRA again. So even though I'm in the clean energy space, I am starting to think more about agriculture and the way that impacts climate change.
Yep.
So I know that you've done a lot of thinking about that as well, because the IRA has $20 billion in funding that goes to agriculture, and part of that is for clean farming practices, part of that is for conservation of agricultural land. And so I'm pretty curious to know about whether there's been any thought that has gone into sort of plant-based agriculture and funding for that. I can imagine there's probably a lot of pushback when it comes to that too. So just curious if that's sort of on the horizon or something you've been thinking about.
It's, you know, I have been more involved internationally on agriculture at this point than I have to know exactly, Jim, I don't know if you know this, but to know exactly what USDA is doing for their smart agriculture, I really don't know. I mean, they're definitely, obviously, looking at a lot of different adaptation strategies for, one of the biggest challenges we face is water.
Right.
I mean, with agriculture. And so that's going to be a big deal. But what I'm focused a lot on is regenerative agriculture. You know, I am this, just to be honest, I am a wannabe anthropologist. That's what I had as my undergraduate degree. I did
Right,
social
right.
anthropology. So I'm fascinated with matching these strategies on with what the actual cultures of those communities want to be successful. And one of the things I'm involved in is in India. It's a whole area of India where they have a lot of rural women farmers. And it's about the training necessary to do regenerative agriculture and to try to get away from the fertilizer, the fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And it's fascinating. That's an interesting health study, is that we're now, don't tell anybody, but I'm doing some work in a fellowship with Tufts, so don't get mad at me. But Tufts has the Fletcher School, which is a terrific international school that's focused on climate and other things, and I'm working with them on this. They're doing a study to look at the benefits of the shift, and one of the big benefits is health. Magnificent. The kind of visits they're getting at health centers in the area when they start making this transition is quite astounding. And so we're looking at that. But I don't know, I honestly don't know as much about what they're doing within USDA as I do with what other countries are doing.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
take care.
Please.
Thanks so much for this. Iram Sattar. I'm an alum of the law school, and I was teaching at Tufts, in fact, on their sustainable water management program.
Really?
So I can sort of give a shout out to that.
Excellent.
But what I want to ask you is two things. So I'm so glad that you mentioned water, because, and also that, of your battles with the hydrocarbon sort of, space. There was a huge article the New York Times just had where they pivoted, where hydrocarbon sort of energy sort of production is pivoting to plastic production. And essentially that's going into, say, PVC manufacturing, right? So 100 billion in the last 10 years, another 100 billion to come. So huge amounts of investment to pivot manufacturing. Now it's concentrated in Texas and Louisiana,
Yes.
but obviously there's a demand side to this also, right? We're using it in construction. I mean, who knows what's happening. So if you could talk a little bit about the impact on communities of just the chemicals transportation that we're hearing and the health impacts of that, living next to where this stuff is moving from. And if you could fold in the issue about one of the things, again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what was exempted was, right, which is the fertilizer exports of Russia, because the world realizes that developing countries, fertilizer costs, if they go up, then we'll have a food security crisis. So if you could address both sort of the geopolitics of that, I mean, what do you know about that production and then the domestic impacts?
Yeah. So let's start with, that's what I was referring to when I called it the petrochemical industry, because really it's been a concerted effort for quite a few years now for the fossil fuel companies, the oil companies, to start shifting their product to plastics manufacturing. That's it. Plastics are made with fossil fuels. And the challenge that you have, and there's plenty of data that can be shared, there's more being collected now, is that there are a tremendous amount of emissions going to the neighboring communities, and most of these facilities, if not all of them, the big ones, are both in environmental justice communities where the health challenges are real, and most of them are expanding. Most of them are growing by 10 or 15, 20%. But the issue is, and this is something I want you to be cautious about, I'm not sure it's our demand as much as them figuring out how to make it our demand, right? I mean, everything is coming out now of plastic. Well, I never asked for that. I still like glass stuff. Do you know what I mean? But they'll make a product, and then they create demand for the product. And that's not just in household products or things you wear. This is how you transform an EV to be lightweight. You know, this is going to be, how do we get around those nasty little lead pipes? I know, PVC, right? And it's hugely challenging. And this is something that I have seen very recently, some additional studies using modern day monitoring technology, which is available on the kind of emissions that communities are being exposed to. And there are a number of communities that are looking for real help to try to fight those expansions. So that's a real thing. On the geopolitics of it, you know, I don't know whether I should say this or not, but I'll say it anyways. I went to a conference, not last year, the prior year, at the end of the year. No, it was just last year, I guess, because I haven't been out even a year. I went last year to the African Leaders Conference in DC. And one of the events was a Breakthrough Energy, I think it was. It was Bill Gates, anyways, was funding something on agriculture in Africa. And it was him and Cargill. Now, you tell me what this was all about, right? And I find what we're seeing now that this is really an industrialization that for many communities that do not want to shift from the kind of agriculture that they have, that have the food security they need, is not being appropriate for transfer to those communities. And so I think it's a very difficult problem. We need food security, but all I'm seeing is folks in the US wanting enough security that the 60% of the arable land in Africa that is 60% of the world's arable lands are in Africa. But that doesn't mean they're for us to industrialize to send it back to us. Enough said. That's what I feel like is happening. It worries me.
Please.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Elaine White. I'm to add up to the former government officials here in this event, former ambassador of Costa Rica to the UN.
Oh, excellent.
Thank you. I have heard many times in the last year and a half, more or less, that I have been here at Harvard, that that we have to think anew. We have to think about new ways of dealing with these global issues like climate change, because it is not efficient to get negotiations among 193 parties. And I've heard strong criticism and attacks against the UN, UNFCCC framework, which for me was pretty disheartening because I served at the UN several times. But I continue hearing that it doesn't matter if Costa Rica makes a commitment towards reducing greenhouse emission, because our contribution is pretty tiny. What does matter is to bring together the great emitters in an effort that actually would make a difference, an impact, which I think kind of makes sense, to have caucuses of countries that can actually make a commitment, an improvement, move the needle. But my question, and now that I also heard this discussion about the EU and the US, so if that is an approach, that we need to get the most important emitters together to get to an agreement that is much more far-reaching, what is holding all these countries back to act together to further reduce, say, the EU, the US, China, India, all the countries that have the biggest. Is that something that you have heard, or it's something that is possible to bring a negotiation?
Well, first of all, I know that Costa Rica is doing a lot, so thank you for that. And I think part of what I hope is that people, countries that step up and really do a lot to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions generally have other benefits that are localized. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. You're not doing it for the benefit of all of us. You're doing it for your benefit. And hopefully that's the type of strategy we're talking about advancing, is not giving up something, but really gaining for what you do. So, and I know Costa Rica's making some really major strides, so thank you for all that. I guess, I get frustrated, in case you can't tell. I'm obnoxious about just wanting to get things done. I mean, that is both my husband will tell you my biggest fault, but the people that work for me in the White House will tell you that's what got it done, because I'm obnoxious. I mean, you can't just keep talking about things endlessly, especially when those things are just taking over your life, right, and your future. And so I've gone to most of the COPs, and it just drives me crazy. It does drive me crazy, I have to say. And they come up with this solution or this statement in the end, and that also drives me crazy, because they had to use the exact right words to give as much wiggle room here that everyone could sign. But I'm a terrible diplomat. So I cannot tell you that there's anything wrong with that. All I can tell you is the rest of us just pull our hair out wondering, well, what does that mean? Is anyone going to do anything? And then you have a war in Ukraine, and it's like, that was a good idea. What are we going to do now? You know what I mean? So I don't have an answer other than I found that during my time in government, the most productive time in government I had was state government. It was not the federal. And generally, things get pushed from the bottom up. And so I just think marrying a lot more integration of lower levels of government into the dialogue, so that they could develop a plan that underpinned this mishmash of whatever the big guys say, and actually bring to life on the ground what could be done, would be very helpful. But we tend never to do that. It's all about one thing. And I do think states go and local governments go, but they don't tend to join in underpinning some of those strategies in a way that might make it more able to move forward in a concrete way. That's all I can think of. But I don't have any other solution to everybody needing to get together and move forward, and having it be done in a way that doesn't put anybody any country at a particular disadvantage. There's nothing that you can do to change that. But I do think change is going to be essential, and maybe having small groups get together prior to or after to set their own standards would be great. I don't know.
I'm going to ask one final question here, because we're just about at our time.
Okay.
Gina, I'm sure there's a number of students in the audience, and of course the youth movement has been incredibly important in terms of changing attitudes both in the United States and globally. Wondering if you could say anything to our students about going forward, what's the role of both youth movements but also personal engagement in climate issues as they think about their careers and their activities?
I honestly don't know anyone in Washington anyone in the White House that does not believe that the young people were the driver of change that got to President Obama and got to everybody. It is absolutely factually correct that what young people are doing and have been doing is what's made change happen. It is the motivator. It is the engine. And they can't let up. You know, you have to keep being active and engaged. And as much as, you know, you need to push for what hasn't been fast enough, I think you need to push for the things that will make things faster. You know, get some positive momentum, get behind things that will really be drivers of change rather than just getting all excited about what didn't happen. But I mean, that's just me being 68 years old, and that's what I told my kids. If all you want to do is bitch and moan, go somewhere else. Find me answers. You know, it's time for that to happen. But young people, I don't want to say this in a way that says all of us have decided to sideline ourselves and it's really all their problem. I don't mean that at all. They are like the conscience of our country. They are the ones that we have to fight for. I don't do any of this in order to save my last 20 years. I do that for my 3 little nose-running grandchildren. And anything that young people can do to keep this in the spotlight and to both encourage when good things are done, but also call out when we haven't done enough. That's the only way that government works. That's how it's designed, and you ought to keep doing that as hard and as loud as you can.
I think that's a great point to end this on. So thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Jim, it was lovely. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jim.